China is well regarded as the world's largest holder of foreign reserves. If we were to graph out the rankings of the world's largest holders of reserves, we get to see just how far ahead China is when we compare it to any other economy globally. It far surpasses any nation in Europe, surpasses Japan, and only if we add the reserves of Japan, Switzerland, the United States and India, only then can these four major economies reach the amount of reserves China has. These huge reserves have been part of the reason for China's international financial influence. But in the past few months, on exactly January 20th, 2025, the second tenure of Donald J. Trump had started, which caused panic in every single economy globally. This was because of his stance on American protectionism. Trump, in his second tenure, promoted an even more aggressive form of economic nationalism. He proposed tariffs, some of which had already been implemented across many countries. If we were to graph out some of the proposed or implemented tariffs so far, we get to see that Trump didn't just talk about tariffs in the low digits, but some of them ranging from 10 to as much as 25% in certain goods. So, what's the problem with these tariffs to China, specifically for China's foreign reserves? Well, the problem with these tariffs is because it impacts China's ability to make money from its overseas operations, which includes exports. Let's graph out the imports of the United States to China for the year 2023. What this data basically shows is how much the United States is buying up goods from China, and, as you can see in the graph right here, for 2023, the US bought up goods of over $448 billion, which makes it the second largest source of importation for the US just behind Mexico. On the other hand, if we were to include the exports of the US to these countries, we get to see that the US doesn't really export a lot, especially to China. For the same year, they only exported $148 billion. The reason why this is so important for China's foreign reserves is because of a concept called trade surplus. A trade surplus occurs when a country exports more than it imports, which allows it to accumulate foreign currency reserves. For example, China is well known to export a wide range of goods, from electronics and machinery to textiles and consumer products. When China exports these goods to the United States, they receive US dollars. And those US dollars can be used to pay for any other imports, or be used for their international operations. But they can also be placed back into China's foreign reserves. The only time they'll be able to place it back into their foreign reserves, however, is if they run what is called a trade surplus. It is, as we mentioned just earlier, happens when a country, for example, China, exports more than they import. This allows them to accumulate foreign reserves. And for a very long time, China has run trade surplus after trade surplus, due to the fact that they have been exporting more goods than they were importing. Let's graph out the net trade in goods of China, data from the World Bank. What this basically shows is how much China has consistently earned in trade surpluses over the years. As you can see from the graph, China's trade balance has remained positive for decades, meaning it has accumulated foreign reserves at a steady pace. But here comes the problem, and it's Trump's tariffs. Trump's tariffs can effectively reduce the amount of goods China exports to the United States, leading to a direct decline in trade surplus. The reason why America is so important for China is simply because they are the largest destination for Chinese exports. If we graph out the largest export by country of China, we get to see just how important the US economy is for them. Here you can see that the US wasn't just a small export destination, it was massive, contributing $436 billion for the year 2023, which puts them leagues above any other economy out there. So, these Trump tariffs can effectively and indeed reduce the amount of what China exports to the US, which could reduce their trade surplus significantly. This can easily be seen through the lens of the first Trump presidency. Back in his first tenure as the President of the United States, one can see that the exports of China had diminished dramatically. Well, for some it isn't a dramatic decrease, but for others it was their livelihoods and employment. Here, you can see in the graph, the exports of China to the United States declined from $538 billion the year when the tariffs began, to just $449 billion, a year after the tariffs began. It declined further to $432 billion by 2020. And ever since these tariffs began, Chinese exports didn't really increase any further than the data seen in 2018. That was the highest in all the years. Furthermore, if we take a look at the current account balance of China, we actually see a big decrease. In 2017, prior to the trade war, China's current account balance was over $188 billion. But by 2018, the year the trade war began, their balance shrunk to just $24.13 billion, but eventually recovered in the coming years. But even though China's exports had declined and didn't see a big trade surplus anymore with the US, their foreign reserves didn't actually go down at all. For instance, if we graph out the total reserves of China and see it historically, we get to see that the years when the tariffs were implemented, they didn't go down. They did see a slight decrease, but it's not the big decrease that many had expected to see. The reason being, well, one possible answer is that the Chinese authorities tightened capital controls, which basically meant that they restricted money from leaving the country easily, and they carefully managed the yuan when the trade war hit. In 2018, as the yuan slid, regulators reportedly stepped in with interventions and controls to largely contain heavy outflows. So, in other words, even though the first Trump tariffs had done significant damage to China's exports to the US, it didn't really decrease the overall foreign reserves of China. That can be partly because of the restrictions on capital controls, but also it might be because China had also seen strong export growth to other markets. The US is, after all, the only one that really implemented significant tariffs on Chinese goods. Many other economies, especially those in the emerging markets like Africa and Southeast Asia, continued to buy Chinese goods as they needed a source of cheap goods to help fuel their growing economies. But for Trump's second tenure, it seems like he's again interested in pursuing tariffs on everyone, and one of them is China. Recently, he already implemented a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports on February 4th, 2025, and a further increase was seen to 20%, signed on March 4th of that year. Would this harm China's trade balance and exports to the US once again? Well, back in his first tenure, the Trump tariffs weren't actually as bad as they are today. The tariffs in 2025 were placed on all, and we would repeat that again. These Trump tariffs are implemented for all Chinese imports. Back in 2018, it wasn't on all imports. They were placed on different goods. Indeed, so one can possibly say that 2025 may be worse than 2018, right? Well, we can't really quantify the impacts so far, as it hasn't shown the effects yet, at least on published data. There is one report, published by the Economist Intelligence EU, saying that they anticipate a 20% reduction on Chinese exports to the US over 2025 to 2027. It would also contract GDP growth by 0.6% over the same period. The impact, however, according to the report, would be partially absorbed by the renminbi's depreciation. The report said that real GDP growth would slow by 4.6% in 2025, then by 4.3% in 2026, and then to 4.1% by 2027. These are, of course, still projections, and they may not really reflect the actual results. But if we were to quantify the impacts of these based on the 20% reduction on Chinese exports, then we can assume that China's exports to the US in 2024, which was $438 billion, then a gradual decrease of, say, 5 to 8% in 2025, then 12 to 15% in 2026, and in 2027, the full decline of 20% to be felt, the exports of China to the US could reach around $350 billion, which is an $88 billion lost in trade revenue for China from 2024 to 2027. Would this impact China's foreign reserves then? Well, likely it might indeed. Just how it impacted their current account balance in 2018 to 2019 It is possible that it would impact their current account balance for 2025 to 2027. But then again, China has a lot of measures to cushion the impact. One measure, which isn't really a measure, can be because China has become less trade dependent from the US in the past few years. If we were to graph out the exports of the US and compare it to the rest of the world, we get to see that for 2023, only 12.8% of China's total exports had gone to the US. This is a sharp contrast to what was seen back in 2017, when Chinese exports were over 20%. What this simply means is that China has been gradually reducing its reliance on the US market. So, as you can see, the impacts of these tariffs made on China may not really be that big, especially as China diversifies. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.